Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, and I manage the SAGE Research Methods community. I'm pleased to be joined today by Rhys Jones. We're going to discuss his new book about statistical literacy. You may recall seeing a previous interview when we discussed his other book, Essential Math Skills for Exploring Social Data. So before we get started in talking about statistical literacy and how to understand it, if you're new to the SAGE Research Methods community, this is a SAGE blog site where we're interested in everything to do with designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, sharing results. And at the heart of this diagram, you see teaching and learning, because we think whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's certainly why I love having the opportunity to talk with researchers like I am today, because I always learn something. So why don't you just begin by introducing yourself?
Thanks, Janet, and delighted to be here today to talk more about my book and my experiences. So I'm a professor of statistical literacy, and until recently, I was the Associate Dean Education in the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences at Surrey University. But previous to that, I worked at Auckland University in their statistics department, where I taught statistics to about 5,000 students per year. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book on stats literacy is that I noticed that the students that were coming into the module that I taught on often struggled with stats in general, but particularly the literacy elements. And I think they were often unaware that they needed to not only appreciate that they had to do analysis and collect data and understand what data meant and scratch beneath the surface, but also be able to kind of craft and pull together the literacy elements and be able to write well, as well as be able to understand what data is and analyze it. So that's really why I wanted to write this book, was to help those students better understand what statistical literacy is.
So how would you, just in a nutshell, define statistical literacy then?
So I would say statistical literacy is the ability to understand and, importantly, reason with data.
Mm-hmm.
And I really see them as skills, like essential skills, not only for students, but for everyone. I mean, these, I think, are really essential skills for citizens. And they're skills that we use every day in everyday life when we're looking at things like the news, TV, talk shows, daytime TV, social media. We're looking at data. We're inundated by data constantly, and our brains are trying to make sense of that data. And when we're trying to reason with that data within our heads and make
Mm-hmm.
sense of that data, this really encompasses what statistical literacy is and how we make sense of that. And then when you take that a step further, when we try and create our own data stories, or we try to kind of write our own data stories, that's when it becomes quite powerful, and you can unlock that power ourselves.
Well, I think you make an important point, because not every student, even at the doctoral level, not every student is preparing to become a scholar, a scholarly researcher, but there are skills that are going to help us in professional life, in decision making, as individuals who are trying to understand the trends and issues in the world, and those who are trying to convince us of their position can try to use numbers in a way to make their case. And if we don't have the kind of basic literacy to understand those, we can really be subject to misinformation that can be damaging.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Janet. And I think um, part in several chapters in the book, in particular, and chapter 8, where it goes into more detail in some of these areas, and chapter 5, where we look at something called epistemology. And as you mentioned, I think doctoral
Mm.
students, particularly in social sciences, where they look more at these areas, where we look at things like validity, reliability, and why do we know what we know, and how do we know what we know? Students struggle with these things. And
Mhm.
of course, you can get very philosophical about these ideas. And then we often ask students to kind of choose a stance. And I remember when I was a doctoral student, I almost felt like I had to retrofit one. But part of my feeling is that we don't teach students early enough about these ideas. And if we did, then they would be much better able to conceptualize and grasp them. And I often will show students, I mean, you've probably seen the iceberg where you kind of say,
Mhm.
this is what you see, right? And all these things underneath, and you can go into epistemology and ontology. And they're interesting ideas because they help people to understand how we know everything and why people think differently. I mean, I originally trained as a biologist, as a scientist, and I noticed a huge shift within myself on how I view the world and the lens that I use and how I see things. And I become more of an educational researcher now, and I see things quite differently.
Mhm.
And I'm able to kind of take a step back and 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 I would have never have done that unless I'd worked in a social sciences department and done a doctorate in education. So it really interesting ideas, and
Mhm.
these are touched on in the book, um, which I think we should really try and get more people to look at because they're really interesting and they're important.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they apply in everyday life as well as in our scholarly work. So, one of the points that you discuss is about telling stories with data and the importance of narratives with data. And I think that, could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because, some people think, I mean, as you've discussed, the importance of being able to reason and understand things and to really reflect on what you know. Um, that statistics are more than simply numbers. So, talk a little bit about that, about the stories and the narratives with data.
Yeah, sure. I mean, being able to tell stories with data and create data stories enables people to or includes using numbers and this might just be using descriptives and descriptive data like looking at perhaps averages or means or things like counts and nothing kind of not necessarily going into inferential statistics where you're doing looking at p-values, but more kind of simple level stuff, and then trying to tell a story. And you often see things like this in newspaper articles, journal reports, on social media, things like Facebook. You might see kind of pie charts, and they're trying to get your attention, maybe clickbait. They're trying to get you to click on
Mm,
things,
mm,
trying to
mm.
get you to buy stuff, and it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's used so much. So we see all these things around us. So trying to get people to understand, to be able to do this themselves, I think it's so valuable because it opens up so many opportunities for people like in the labor market, and we need more people with these skills as we live in a society that's becoming increasingly full of data. and
Right.
and particularly I mean, I go into a bit more detail in chapter 6 and 10, where I look at something called the Pixar method. And you'd have Pixar, which is Disney, and they
Mhm.
do this really well. And it's something that I think most people are familiar with. You start with a beginning, middle, end. But what they craft and what they are able to do, Disney, is create characters that really pull on our emotions and tug on our emotional strings. And that's why they're so powerful and so successful, is because they create these great narratives, and are able to pull on our emotional strings. But being able to, I suppose, in a more academic context, being able to make that credible and insert numbers and data can really help to be persuasive and
Mhm.
create a persuasive argument.
Well, and certainly when we think about on the scholarly side, writing journal articles, that are readable and understandable, that we don't assume that the reader has the same exact background that we do. So, to be able to present things, in a way that are interesting and engaging and pull you in, that are not simply relaying, a series of charts and graphs and numbers, but actually put it into some context that people can get some meaning from.
Yeah, exactly and those skills are really important. And I mean, particularly, I mean, if you're thinking more in an academic context, I mean, as you think about students moving through the different stages, in a variety of different disciplines, what we're really looking for is for them to be able to present a critical argument. So they've looked at different perspectives, they've evaluated them, so they've weighed them up, and then they've presented their argument and said, well, this is why I think this, and these are the reasons. And being able to do that with data, whether that's in a qualitative or quantitative context, really is what we're looking for as academics. And that's what when we award the higher grades, that's really what we're looking for. And that's when they get those high grades, is when they do that well. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about data stories, is being able to do that and present a good story with data.
So what are some of the common misconceptions in statistics and statistical literacy?
There's so many. And I remember, particularly during the COVID years, I mean, I think lots of people who, I mean, my area is statistical kind of communication and literacy, and I'm not one of those people that are into doing like advanced statistics and stats analysis, but I'm into the communication of stats and being able to present it well. So when I was looking at TV reports and looking at some of these kind of world-renowned scientists trying to communicate data to the public, it was a lot of the time it was just a shambles. And I actually got quite angry presenting graphs that had acronyms on axes that weren't explained, or they just they were talking about things like averages and mixing it up with means and modes, and kind of saying it doesn't matter how you collect the data. All these things that were really important when we're looking at things like validity, reliability, that will have an impact on the data, the statistics, and the analysis and the conclusions when you're trying to draw and make meaningful conclusions from what you've done. They're really important areas. One of the biggest misconceptions in statistics, particularly within the natural sciences, the biological sciences, is looking at p-values. And the p-value is often seen as kind of a binary outcome, whether you've got significance or no significance. And what we need to remember with p-values is that we're often looking at how much evidence we have against the null hypothesis. And what they're looking for, what researchers are looking for is, oh, I've got a significant result. And then they'll say, that means that we found evidence of an effect on the treatment. And if we haven't got a significant result, that means there's no effect, which isn't necessarily correct. So there's lots of misconceptions around p-values and their understanding. I mean, when I taught at Auckland University, and Auckland University Stat Department is world leading in their teaching of statistics from education, but also it's one of the biggest in the world. And when I talk to my colleagues, they would often say, well, what I'd really want my students to do is to be able to understand a p-value, because it's quite complex. So that's a p-values in particular are areas, I think it's a difficult concept to understand. What we're really trying to get people to understand is we're looking at how much evidence there is against the null hypothesis, and then you go down that hypothesis testing route. Now, there was quite recently, I think the Journal of Psychology, they said they were going to kind of just throw out hypothesis testing completely and not include it. But I think there is a place for it in research, and as long as it's used correctly,
Mhm.
and used well.
So let's just talk a little bit about your book. I mean, it sounds like um, this might be, the kind of book that a student might want to buy, whether it is actually being taught in their class or not, to help them kind of grasp the basic concepts that, maybe they're struggling with in a more advanced stats class. Just, talk a little bit about, who might benefit from this book.
So the lots of the examples that are used within the book um, cut across many different disciplines. So they sit within
Mhm.
biological sciences, biosciences, health sciences. There's some business examples in there as well, social sciences examples. So students that are within those domains, I think, would really benefit at looking at this.
Mhm.
But I think more generally, any subjects that have data within them, I think it really helps set the foundations. Because so it starts off helping people to write well. And
Mhm.
I try to position it not to kind of be insulting or patronizing,
Right.
but this is from experience and students and sometimes it's just a case of if you don't use it, you lose it. Sometimes when you're going through your studies, you forget to do some of these things. So just writing well and making sure that you're writing sentences that are not too long, writing paragraphs that are not too big, just little reminders of how to do
Mhm.
these things. And then it moves
It
on.
seems like clarity is one of the important points in your work.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just little kind of nuggets of reminders just to kind of help people um to give them a little boost for
Mhm.
their subjects and their studies.
And what kind of courses might this be suitable for as a text?
So business students, students doing a range of business studies, for example, accounts, economics, um, students in the biological sciences, health subjects, health and well-being, public sciences, public health, statistics, um, political sciences would be quite useful as well. And I'd say one quite useful feature that I'd also just like to raise, which I think is quite
Mhm.
useful. I included a section in there called sensitive data. And
Mhm.
then, again, this is from experience. A few years ago when I was teaching in Auckland, some of the examples that I was using were looking at things like HIV rates, and we were looking at things like homelessness in San Francisco. And we were exploring social science topics. So
Mhm.
again, people doing social sciences and those types of criminology and those areas would benefit from looking at this. And we were looking at areas that affect us as people and affect and look at society and explore society. And a student that was studying this paper, he was doing a psychology degree, and they came up to me and they were quite upset by some of the examples that I was using, and they weren't happy because they felt like I should have used more neutral data sets. So, and I know this topic has come up before with other people, other colleagues, particularly things like you might be looking at cancer rates, and say a student might be affected because their parents then might have cancer, and I
Mhm.
and I said to this student, um, please can you just address all your concerns in an email, and I'll reply to you. And I was very patient with the student. I feel like I was, and I
Mhm.
said to them, kind of, I feel like it's my duty as an educator to show you the real world, and this is why I'm teaching you these examples. But when it came to writing this book, it came up again, and I used an example which looked at who make the best lovers in the world, right? And so several colleagues at Sage said, "Oh, you shouldn't be using this example because it's kind of well inappropriate, or some people might, And it reminded me of this case in New Zealand, this student in New Zealand that wasn't happy. So I kind of flipped back to my thinking. It's my kind of duty as an educator to show people
Mhm.
the real world, and outside of this book or outside of my classroom, I feel like people are going to perhaps come across these things.
Mhm.
So I suggested that I present a kind of an option, like a kind of off button. So there's examples in the book that come across that explain some contexts in, say, religion or faith, or that explore sexuality or gender. And if people don't want to explore these areas for whatever reason, if it perhaps is emotionally triggering or they feel like it might get too much for them, then it's labeled as sensitive data. So they have that option to not explore those tasks and examples. And I think it is a really important point, because we're in a society that is just saturated with data, and statistics is all about what does the data, what do the numbers mean? They're not just numbers on their own, like in mathematics, where often you can just kind of do number work, and you can see these mathematicians, they enjoy working through numbers and then the methods. Statistics, stats, numbers are, you need to look beneath what the numbers mean, and they always have a context. So that's why I felt this was an important feature in the book.
Mhm. Right. I think it is an important feature today, and how to deal with sensitive matters in a scholarly way. Those are really important skills to acquire, and also to understand what might be, appropriate or not in a particular class or whatever
Yeah.
course, classroom, but still to have some sense of how to handle those. For social scientists, we can't be afraid of problematic situations that we may wish were different,
Yeah.
in the world. Well, thank you for taking the time to give us a little bit of background about some of these issues and why they're important, and to introduce your book to our readers.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you.